Begin now that Senator Cotton is here. And I want to say good afternoon. I'm really grateful that you all are here for really an important, I think, constructive discussion. Welcome to our witnesses who've traveled here to provide testimony to this subcommittee. I'm particularly grateful to Ranking Member Cotton for his perspective on this important topic relating to labor in prisons. Most Americans really are shocked that they learn that the 13th Amendment, which formally abolished slavery in our country, excludes incarcerated people. It's called the Exception Clause, which was approved by our very Senate Judiciary Committee in 1864. The language of the Exception Clause lives on not only in our federal Constitution, but also in 16 state constitutions. Today, almost 150 years after ratification, we're here to discuss the legacy of this clause and how it impacts the treatment of incarcerated workers in our nation's prisons and jails. This hearing is intended to shed light on the real issues facing the workforce that lives behind bars, not to end the opportunity to work in prisons. I want to emphasize that. I was grateful in reading the testimony of all of our witnesses about how everybody understands that work in prisons could be a very important part of rehabilitation, preparing people for life outside of prison, and frankly, to help lower recidivism rates. And I'm glad that from reading the testimony of all four witnesses, there seems to be some accord in that. It should be in our goal, really a collective goal in our society, that people in prison develop the professional skills that set them up for success once they're released. But they can only do so within a humane system that honors human dignity. This goal, I know, is shared by Republicans and Democrats alike because for my 25 years in my professional life, I've worked with people on both sides of the aisle on these issues. And the reality is that most people that go to prison actually come out. We saw some draconian measures at times where people said, why should we have Pell Grants for people in prison? Well, every dollar we try to take away from investing in education actually costs taxpayers much more than that in terms of recidivism rates. Empowering people to take responsibility and to learn skills is something we support. What I'm excited about also is that in red states and in blue states, Nebraska, basically every single worker in our country is guaranteed certain protections against exploitation and abuse. The government guarantees American workers that their workplace also will be safe and hazard-free, and that they will not be discriminated against in the workplace, and that they will receive a minimum wage for their labor. I've been excited recently. We've seen bipartisan legislation from this committee to stop gender discrimination and recently age discrimination in the workplace. And the Judiciary Committee, in a bipartisan manner, is doing even more on that. These laws do not reach the people who work within the walls of our nation's jails and prisons. There are close to 1.2 million people incarcerated in this country, and today around 800,000 of them have a job. Incarcerated Americans contribute to our economy by working jobs that touch many products and goods that we all use and purchase. They produce and process foods that we eat. They work in factories manufacturing license plates, traffic signs, uniforms, and furniture, much of which bears the sought-after Made in America label. They also provide critical public services by fighting wildfires, repairing and maintaining roads, and responding to natural disasters. And they work in prison facilities to help maintain the operations. Most of us have no idea how this labor contributes to our nation's economy. Incarcerated workers around the country produce more than $2 billion in goods and over $9 billion a year in services, maintaining the prisons in which they live. Yet an incarcerated worker can earn an averagely hourly wage of literally a few cents per hour to half a dollar. In 7 states, incarcerated workers are paid nothing for their labor. They also lack a minimum health and safety standards in their workplaces and cannot refuse to work even if they are injured or sick, facing harsh disciplinary consequences I know we'll hear about today if they should. I want to acknowledge that this topic may make some of us uncomfortable. Many of us bristle when we hear words like slavery and that the fact that we are causing folks to work who do not want to. I'm keenly aware that we are at a point in our nation where we can objectively analyze, does this reflect our values, our collective values as a country? We know that it's hard to reconcile a lot of the practices with the democratic ideals of our country, but we must face it together so that we ultimately can address it. Our prisons should reflect the best of who we are, they should reflect our values, and they should, in my strong opinion, be places that are not just for punishment, but for rehabilitation and for creating roads of redemption. I believe the ideals of redemption are very much a part of our nation's core values and help us create a safer, stronger nation. By ensuring that incarcerated people receive workplace protections, that they're compensated fairly, and they're not retaliated against if they decline work, we can create a system that reflects those values and builds the vocational skills necessary for people to have successful reentry, thereby improving public safety. I look forward to having a productive and constructive conversation. This extraordinary panel, I'm grateful that you're here. And with that, I'll turn to my ranking member of the subcommittee, my colleague from Arkansas, Tom Cotton.
Well, unlike Senator Booker, I don't think many Americans would be surprised or shocked that the 13th Amendment allows prison labor. It's been there from the very beginning. It's just as much a part of our Constitution as is any other provision. I do suspect, though, at this hearing, we're going to hear more from Democratic senators and their witnesses unfairly attacking our prison systems and the outstanding men and women who serve in them. They might even compare prison work programs to slavery. This is a vicious and ugly smear against the very skilled, brave men and women who work and serve in our prisons as law enforcement and correctional officers. Such talk may be fashionable in faculty lounges and Washington, D.C. cocktail parties, but it's wholly divorced from the reality on the ground in our prisons. Prisons are dangerous places full of dangerous people. Given nothing to occupy their time, prisoners will usually regress back to doing what they were sent to prison for in the first place. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. Reducing idle time has always been a key policy objective for prison labor programs. Almost 100 years ago, this very committee held hearings on prison labor, just like this one. The committee issued a report finding that prison work programs help maintain order inside prisons. This committee said, quote, unanimously conceded that idleness in prisons breeds disorder and aggravates criminal tendencies, and concluded that prison work prevents prison violence by replacing idle time with productive activity. But it's not just about filling otherwise idle time. This committee's 1930 report also found that prison jobs help prepare inmates for life on the outside by teaching them, quote, habits of industry. Our prison work programs have come a long way since 1930. Today, many prisons partner with technical college that gives inmates the opportunity to receive job skill certificates. Many offer pre-apprenticeship opportunities as well. Some programs even allow inmates to work for private employers at market wages, giving them the opportunity to pay off victim restitution, meet child support obligations, and save money for life after prison. Contrary to what we'll probably hear today, there's nothing illegal or unconstitutional about prison labor, even for little or no pay, nor is there anything immoral about it. Prison labor is a way for inmates to give something back to the society they wronged. American society doesn't owe criminals restitution. Criminals owe our society restitution. And if that means scrubbing toilets, mopping floors, or picking up the garbage, then so be it. In summary, prison jobs help keep the peace, teach inmates job skills and work habits, and fulfill the original objectives of prison. Most prison officials would tell our committee just that, which is why I wish we had a representative from a prison here today to speak about these programs. I had invited a respected representative of the Arkansas prison system to testify, and he had agreed, but after seeing the amended title of this hearing, which for a few days last week equated prison labor to slavery, he chose not to attend. That's very understandable on his part, but it's also unfortunate for us. If the Democrats were not interested in pursuing an ideological agenda, we might have learned something today. In any case, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. We will now introduce and swear in the distinguished panel of witnesses. The witnesses will give their opening testimony, and senators will have 5 minutes for questioning. I'll briefly introduce the majority witnesses, and then I'll ask the ranking member, Senator Cotton, to introduce the final witness. Our first witness is Terrence Win. At the age of 16, Mr. Win was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole and ultimately served 30 years of imprisonment after the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Miller versus Alabama and Montgomery versus Louisiana resulted in his eligibility for parole. Mr. Win was incarcerated in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly known as Angola, where he worked on the cotton fields of Angola, in culinary services and as a nurse's aide. Since his release, Mr. Win has become an advocate for prison reform and serves as the executive director and founder of the Louisiana nonprofit Priorities, Intentions, Practices, Practical Exchanges, or PIPES. Our second witness is Jennifer Turner. Ms. Turner is the principal human rights researcher in the Human Rights Program at the American Civil Liberties Union. For more than 16 years, she has conducted documented research and advocacy on human rights violations in the United States with a focus on the criminal legal system, policing, economic injustice, and racial injustice in the United States. She led a multi-year human rights investigation on incarcerated labor and is the primary author of Captive Labor, a report co-published by the ACLU and the Global Human Rights Clinic of the University of Chicago Law School, documenting the exploitation of incarcerated workers. Ms. Turner is a graduate of New York University Law School, where she was a Root Tilden Kern Scholar, and Yale University. Our third witness is Professor Andrea Armstrong. Professor Armstrong is a 2023 MacArthur Fellow and the Dr. Norman C. Francis Distinguished Professor at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law, where she teaches in the related fields of constitutional law, criminal law, and procedure. She is a scholar on incarceration law and brings much needed transparency to incarceration practices in the United States. She integrates law, history, public health, and the arts in her efforts to educate broad audiences about the human costs of incarceration. Professor Armstrong is a graduate of Yale Law School, the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and New York University. I'll turn to Senator Cotton now to introduce the final witness, Mr. Charles Lehman.
Thank you. Charles Lehman is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where he works on the Policing and Public Safety Initiative and as a contributing editor of City Journal. His work has appeared in outlets including The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, National Affairs, and National Review. He has discussed public safety policy before the House of Representatives and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and at colleges such as Carnegie Mellon and Cornell. He is a 2023 and 24 Robert Novak Fellow with the Fund for American Studies. Before joining the Manhattan Institute in 2021, he was a staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon. He's originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He now lives outside Washington with his wife and sons.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to ask all the witnesses to please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I'm going to mark that everybody said yes. Let the record show that is the affirmative, and you all can sit down now. And you will each have 5 minutes for your opening testimony, starting with Mr. Win and then proceeding to your left, my right. Mr. Win.
Hello, and thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to address you today. My name is Department of Corrections number 296659, or Terrence Win, a native of the plantation known as Angola by way of Shreveport. Angola is also known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, an 18,000-acre prison larger than the island of Manhattan. My name change took place on December 25th, 1989, when I was a 16-year-old kid and took the life of Jeffrey Owens and attempted to take the life of DeJuan Lewis. For my actions, I was arrested and taken to Shreveport's Juvenile Detention Center, where Judge where Judge Gallinger ordered that I be tried as an adult. I was immediately taken to juvie and left in a one-man cell at the parish jail. For my crimes, Judge Hamilton gave me life without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years to be served at hard labor. I heard my mother cry when the judge read the sentence, but I promised her and myself that one day I would come home. I was eventually transferred to Angola, at the time one of the bloodiest penitentiaries in the world. Upon entering the gates of that former plantation, one sees a beautiful manicured lawn. There are flowers and open fields. For 1 second, I thought maybe this wouldn't be so bad. That second didn't last. Within a few days, I was transferred to the infirmary, where a doctor is in charge of determining if a person is fit to work the fields. As a 17-year-old, the doctor confirmed that I was fit to work. I had never worked a day in my life when I found myself walking out of a gate, rifles pointed at me, next to a guy that I didn't know. The line was made up of 125 men. When the last guy came through the gates, we were counted by the guards, and the field foreman got on his horse and gave an order, walk it out. The field is a back-breaking work. Every day we would walk for miles in excessively hot weather and work sometimes bent over on our knees without breaks for hours. We would go in to eat, then out again until the day was finished. Working in the fields, I was forced to goose pick, that's picking grass with your hands. I was forced to dig ditches. I was forced to cut the levee with a hoe, while officers on horses looked over us holding rifles. There were a few occasions when the field warden decided to bring the line in early from work. Those rare occasions happened when one of the horses would fall due to the oppressive heat. If a man fell over, we kept working. If you got injured, you kept working. Nothing took precedence over going to work. I witnessed tools fights that led to the death of a man and was kept working until I got and kept working. I suffered a back injury at the age of 25, an injury I live with today, and I was forced to work until I got so tired of suffering that I chose to be sent to the hole. That's the dungeon or administrative segregation. I spent 30 years at Angola. 25 of those years was spent working in the field. I received 75 disciplinary write-ups for aggravated work offense. This means, in layman terms, refusing to work. I mostly refused to work because of the physical pain, more so than out of a rebellious nature. I admit, though, every time I was told to pick cotton, I refused to do it. Every time I chose to go to the dungeon. 2 cents an hour, 8 days a week. 2 cents an hour, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That is the pay that makes us human and not slaves. Those 2 cents never made me feel better than how I know my ancestors felt. I felt humiliated every time I had to use the restroom in the field, every time a horse defecated in my path as I walked to a work site, every time a guard refused to let me use the restroom with threats of writing me up, every time a white field foreman called the whole line ends or boys, and every time a guard took their anger out on me while I worked. Was the modern version of slavery better for me than it was for my ancestors? 2 cents is what separates 17th century slavery and 21st century slavery. The dungeon replaces the whip as punishment. The dungeon is a place of humiliation where you're stripped of all your possessions and placed in a jumpsuit. You can only have a toothbrush and toothpaste, nothing else. Just you and your thoughts and the sounds of people losing their minds or fighting or being beaten to death. After 25 years being forced to work in fields, I was assigned as a tail walker, a job that forces you to be an inmate guard. The job requires me to walk up and down the extended lockdown tiers for hours, making sure that no one was trying to commit suicide. You become a security guard and a mental health worker while being labeled as a rat. I also attended the Culinary School of Arts in Angola, and once I completed the course, I became a kitchen worker. My last job was a nurse's aide, a job that changed my life forever. Taking care of people who were dying and could no longer take care of themselves, showing care and compassion for guys in their final days, that truly changed me. 30 years of incarceration at hard labor. I never made more than 16 cents an hour. It would have been easy to come home and never look back. But when I was released, I found my old neighborhood plagued with violence and a lack of resources. So I immediately knew what I needed to do. I founded my organization, PIPES, Priorities, Intentions, and Practical Exchanges. Our mission was and remains today to make life better for our community members, especially our youth, while working with formerly incarcerated people in their reentry process. Post-incarceration syndrome is real, and our people need support. I still think about my family all those years serving time with me. I think about the families of people who are incarcerated today, all of them directly impacted as well. My goal doing the work I do is to keep our communities safe and thriving. I believe we can create a system that does not simply punish perpetrators, but works with them while investing in our community and taking care of victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Win. Ms. Turner.
Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union, I thank you for the privilege of testifying before this subcommittee today. Incarcerated labor has a long and problematic history in the United States, rooted in racial oppression. The roots of modern-day prison labor programs can be traced to the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. Given this gaping loophole, states turned to incarcerated labor as a means of partially replacing chattel slavery and the free labor force slavery provided. Today, our nation incarcerates over 1.2 million people in state and federal prisons, and 2 out of 3 of these incarcerated people are also workers. In most instances, the jobs these people in prisons have look similar to those of millions of people working on the outside. They work as cooks, janitors, and groundskeepers, or in laundries and factories. Outside the prison walls, incarcerated people provide vital public services, such as repairing roads, fighting wildfires, or clearing debris after hurricanes. They cultivate and harvest crops, some on penal plantations situated on land that was originally the site of slave plantations. But there are 2 crucial differences. Incarcerated workers are under the complete control of their employers, and they've been stripped of even the most minimal protections against labor exploitation and abuse. From the moment they enter the prison gates, they can be forced to work. More than 76% of incarcerated workers report that they're required to work or face additional punishment, such as solitary confinement, denial of opportunities to reduce their sentence, and loss of family visitation. Illness, injury, disability, or physical inability to work often does not relieve them of work duties. U.S. law explicitly excludes incarcerated workers from the most universally recognized workplace protections, including health and safety laws. Incarcerated people sometimes work in dangerous industrial settings or hazardous conditions that would be closely regulated and monitored if they were not incarcerated. Workers are assigned work in unsafe conditions without the standard training or protective gear provided in workplaces outside prisons. In numerous cases we documented nationwide, serious injuries and deaths could have been prevented with proper training, machine guarding mechanisms, or personal protective equipment. Incarcerated workers are not covered by minimum wage laws and are paid on average 13 to 52 cents per hour in non-industry jobs. More than 80% have maintenance jobs that support the operation of the prison facilities and are compensated at the lower end of prison pay scales. In 7 states, incarcerated people are paid nothing at all for most jobs. Even if an incarcerated worker earns pennies, these low wages are not theirs to keep. Across the country, prisons deduct as much as 80% from incarcerated people's paychecks for room and board and legal financial obligations. In the federal prison system, 59% of the wages earned by incarcerated workers employed in the Federal Prison Industries Program was deducted by the federal government. Prison systems charge incarcerated people exorbitant costs for basic necessities like phone calls home, decent food, hygiene products, and medical care. Families, many of whom are impoverished themselves, spend an estimated $2.9 billion a year on commissary accounts and phone calls. Over half of these families are forced to go into debt to afford the costs of a relative's conviction and subsequent incarceration. However, someone is profiting in the American prison system. Incarcerated workers produce real profits for state prisons and state governments, the primary beneficiaries of forced prison labor. Nationally, incarcerated workers produce more than $2 billion a year in goods and commodities and over $9 billion a year in services for the maintenance of the prisons where they're warehoused. The captive labor system of American prisons hides the staggering cost of our country's bloated prison system. The promise of providing incarcerated people with transferable skills and work experience for their eventual reentry into society often proves illusory. In reality, the vast majority of work programs in prisons involve menial and repetitive tasks that provide workers with no marketable skills or training. Prison industries jobs and vocational training programs are declining. Studies show that people who had some savings when they leave prison and got jobs after their release were less likely to recidivate than those who did not. We all have an interest in prison work being something beyond pure punitive exploitation. Yet, despite the potential for prison labor to facilitate rehabilitation, the existing system very often offers nothing beyond exploitation. It does not have to be this way. Work in prisons could be truly voluntary. Conditions could be safe. Jobs could provide incarcerated people with marketable skills and vocational training that will help them to find employment after release. Incarcerated workers should be paid a fair wage that enables them to save for the future, support their families, and sets them up for successful reentry. To move in this direction, we first must end forced labor without exception by repealing federal and state constitutional exception clauses and guarantee incarcerated workers the standard labor protections available to other workers in the United States, including minimum wages, overtime pay, health and safety standards, unionization and collective bargaining, and protection from discrimination and retaliation. These recommendations are incorporated into the legislation led by Senator Booker, and the ACLU has endorsed each of these bills. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and provide background and context for the subcommittee's important work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Turner. Mr. Lehman.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to address you. As you're aware, there are some 1.2 million people in American prisons today. 95% will eventually return home. A key question for today's hearing is whether their work in prison will prepare them for that return. I am an analyst of public policy. I am not here to speak to the legal or normative merits of prison labor. Rather, I want to make a simple argument. Prison labor makes offenders more employable post-release and thus less likely to reoffend. Consequently, prison labor should be viewed as part of rehabilitation, not an impediment to it. Many criminals reoffend. Among a cohort of prisoners released in 2008, 2/3 were rearrested within 3 years. Reducing recidivism benefits offenders, taxpayers, and society at large. The relationship between crime and employment is not straightforward. Nonetheless, some evidence indicates that employment conditions affect recidivism risk. One study of 4 million prisoners found that those released into worse labor market conditions are more likely to reoffend, all else equal. Data on 1.7 million Californian releasees repeats this finding, specifically showing employment in construction and manufacturing reduced recidivism. Why might employment reduce recidivism? Most obvious reason is that illicit wages discourage criminal employment. Research finds that more money reduces risk of property but not violent crime, consistent with a model in which property crime and work substitute. Beyond the simple relationship, employment might impose pro-social norms, relieve social pressures, or simply limit opportunities for offending. The employment-recidivism relationship is particularly important in the context of incarceration. Incarceration's effect on recidivism is complex. Nonetheless, when incarceration causes recidivism, it is likely by making the offender less employable. One widely cited analysis of Texas data found that incarceration caused significant increases in reoffending, reduced subsequent employment and earnings, and increased dependence on public welfare. Analysis of a cohort of Hungarian offenders provides similar evidence on prison's effect on employment. Why does incarceration reduce employment? Most obviously, a criminal record scares off employers. In one recent survey of nearly 1,000 U.S. businesses, less than 40% were willing to hire someone with a criminal record. If employment prevents recidivism, and if prison can increase recidivism by reducing employment, crime control policy must help those returning from prison to get jobs. How can we do this? One popular solution is to make it harder for employers to discriminate against ex-offenders. Many states have implemented policies that automatically expunge records, prohibit asking applicants about their criminal background. Fortunately, these policies do not have their intended effects and can harm otherwise disadvantaged non-offenders. Research on Massachusetts' Ban the Box law found that it actually decreased ex-offenders' employment. The laws also increased discrimination against black men. Research has further found that banning the box reduced young black men's employment by 3 percentage points and increased the employment gap between white and black applicants. The evidence is similarly pessimistic for quote-unquote clean slate laws. A recent comprehensive analysis examining 3 different clean slate initiatives finds that expungement has essentially no effect on employment on average. Policymakers, therefore, should prioritize making offenders employable. Few interventions are as obvious for this purpose as giving people jobs in prison. Evidence supports this approach. One analysis of 77,000 Indiana and Tennessee prisoners employed by private firms found that participation in prison work is associated with significant reductions in recidivism at the 1- and 2-year marks compared to a matched control group. Another, following a cohort of 6,000 offenders released in Minnesota, found that those who worked were 24% more likely than controls to find a job, worked more hours, and had higher total wages, and the number of hours working was significantly associated with lower recidivism rates. There's also benefit to prisoners working outside the prison walls. Evidence suggests that work release, prisoners being moved to low security facilities and being allowed out to work during the day, improves employment outcomes and reduces recidivism for property but not violent offenders, a finding consistent with the literature previously discussed. Other evidence comes from abroad. Research on Italian offenders found that among those serving more than 6 months, additional unskilled work reduced the reincarceration rate by between 3 and 10 percentage points. Another analysis found that incarceration in Norwegian prisons caused a steep reduction in reoffense, about 29 percentage points, driven entirely by those who did not work prior to their incarceration. That group also saw an increase in future employment and earnings. To this last, some might object that Norwegian prisons are not like American prisons. The former are generally regarded as unusually humane, the latter as unusually inhumane. Bracket the fact that evidence from other nations and from US states indicates that prison labor reduces recidivism. The basic problem with this view is that it assumes the quality of US prisons cannot be affected by policy. There's much we do not know about what works in prison employment. This is a general problem. Most federal rehabilitation programming is not evidence-based. Any reforms to federal prison labor practices should incorporate a commitment to research on what works. That said, the evidence suggests that having incarcerated people work makes them more employable and less likely to reoffend. On this basis alone, we ought to see prison labor as part of the rehabilitation equation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Liebman. Helpful testimony. Professor Armstrong.
Good afternoon, Chairman Booker, Ranking Member Cotton, members of the subcommittee, and Senator Kennedy. Thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And as Senator Booker mentioned, I teach in the areas of constitutional law and criminal law. I also research incarceration law and policy. I have also visited and audited prisons and jails across the country. In March 2024, Mr. Pharrell Scarborough, an incarcerated worker at Louisiana State Penitentiary, died after falling from a flatbed truck and being crushed by heavy lockers. According to the incarcerated witnesses, there were no guardrails or safety straps on that truck. And unfortunately, Mr. Scarborough is not the only preventable death that has occurred in the incarcerated workplace. The Associated Press has documented deaths and significant injuries, including amputations, of incarcerated workers across the nation. In a 2021 Law Review article, Beyond the 13th, I discussed 4 key features of the American incarcerated labor system. Incarcerated people are forced to work for little or even no pay in some states, in dangerous working conditions, with little value for themselves, their communities, or in fact, public safety. Today, though, I just want to highlight 2 features of that system. 1, the coercive context in which incarcerated labor occurs, and 2, the lack of legal protection for incarcerated work conditions. So let's go to the first. When you are in the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week custody of your employer, employee discipline looks different. It can be much more severe. If your supervisor, who is also a prison guard, is not pleased by your work or your job performance, he can send you to solitary confinement. He can deny you visits with your children or with your spouse. These prison guard decisions are really difficult to challenge after the fact. The Prison Litigation Reform Act makes it hard to access federal courts, and even if you make it to court, legal doctrines defer to prison guard decision-making. The possibility of severe punishment can also deter incarcerated workers from advocating for their own safety. Refusing to work in dangerous conditions could even lead to new criminal charges and new sentences in some states. And we, the general public, have no idea, because this forced labor occurs in spaces that lack independent oversight, transparency, and accountability. The second point I want to emphasize is that incarcerated workers are generally unprotected by existing employment and workspace law. Incarcerated workers, especially those who are working for the prison itself on prison grounds are often not considered quote unquote employees by federal agencies or by courts. This is in part because Congress has been silent on the matter. The lack of workplace protection is compounded by the lack of remedies for job-related injuries. This coercive context of incarcerated labor, combined with the lack of protection or remedies, makes incarcerated labor exploitative and dangerous. Working conditions behind bars can kill and injure incarcerated workers. It burdens families, it stretches staff and resources, and can undermine a central purpose of incarceration, namely to ensure that crimes do not reoccur. But we can choose a different path. If the goal is better public safety through reducing recidivism, we can make incarcerated labor look like free labor, and that will better prepare incarcerated workers for future freedom. This could include measures to protect incarcerated workers and workplaces, easing access to courts, and enhancing transparency, including data on work-related injuries and discipline. In conclusion, incarceration law and incarceration labor touches us all. Some of us send money to support a loved one behind bars because they only earn pennies a day. This hurts rural, poor, and minority communities in particular. Some of us buy goods from private corporations that were produced with prison labor. And prisons are also our institutions. They operate in our name with our tax dollars. And when incarcerated labor is exploitative, it undermines public trust and legitimacy of our criminal justice system. I urge this subcommittee to treat these issues with the urgent attention that they deserve. Thank you for the opportunity to share my research, and thank you for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong. I'm going to defer to my colleagues who I think may have other places to go, and we'll start with Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Yes, indeed, we're excited about it. I'm not going to preempt the announcement, but some good news coming out of the Bureau of Reclamation at the Department of Interior this afternoon for California water users. And I'll just leave it at that for now, but appreciate the flexibility here. And thank you to all the witnesses for participating today. To help address the growing wildfire threat facing California, we have long relied on the Conservation Camp Program, which is our State Department of Corrections volunteer firefighting program. The incarcerated individuals who volunteer to join the Conservation Camp Program have at times comprised up to 40% of the state's total firefighting force. So it's not insignificant. And I do want to make it a point to emphasize the voluntary nature of this program. It's voluntary, but so attractive that we've often see waiting lists for incarcerated individuals who want to participate in the program. Now, many participants in California's firefighting program have described the experience as valuable for building real-life skills. And more than 300 formerly incarcerated firefighters have used these qualifications and actual certifications. So it's not just the skills, the training, and the experience, but certification to go on to earn a job with CAL FIRE, the state's firefighting force. I think this program can serve as a model for how we help incarcerated individuals develop useful skills and the necessary certifications to help them find meaningful, well-paying work post-release. My first question is for Ms. Armstrong. How can we build on this model in California to help establish clear links between prison labor work and opportunities for employment post-release?
One of the most significant features, I believe, of the California system is the fact that legal roadblocks to people serving as firefighters upon release were removed. Right? And so when we think about what happens behind bars, the things that people are trained for, it is also just as important to look at, are there barriers to them assuming those professions and vocations after the fact? The second thing that I would mention about the California program is something that I hear from other programs, and I believe Mr. Win also mentioned today, which is being trained in the helping professions, teaching, tutoring, nursing, those professions that help others can be life-changing in terms of the rehabilitative potential of prisons. Thank you.
Thank you. And sort of a follow-up question for Ms. Turner. Can you speak to the issue of helping incarcerated individuals obtain the necessary certifications themselves to actually utilize the skills they're developing in a post-release work?
Yes, thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, this is an important feature of vocational programs that will be successful and set people up for success upon release. But the reality is that more than 80% of incarcerated workers are engaged in maintenance work that isn't setting them up for those jobs. But certainly the path forward requires us to expand these vocational programs, to expand job opportunities that can directly lead to work opportunities after release, including direct lines to employment, letters of recommendation, skills training in industries that are projected to increase in the workforce. The reality is that many, even of our vocational programs, are in areas of work that are declining. Legislative oversight of prison industries programs in Texas and Mississippi, for instance, found that they were training people in jobs that are little to no job prospects, such as garment industry manufacturing or farm work. But there are examples of programs and opportunities here to provide people with the training that will set them up for gaining stable employment after they're released from prison.
So I know there's different types of vocational programs. You see examples
Absolutely.
in states across the country. Coming back to California for a second. Now, California takes steps to ensure that the wildfire work, which comes with risk, it's not easy, can be dangerous, but so it's important to make sure that the program is truly voluntary. We're not forcing inmates to perform this work. But often, how often are incarcerated individuals recruited to work jobs, and how do we make sure that they are not being forced to work? Can you comment on what policies and safeguards should be in place to ensure that it's truly voluntary and not forced labor?
Sure. So currently, nearly all states in the federal prison have compulsory work programs, and there are clear punishments levied against people who are unwilling or unable to perform the job assigned to them, including solitary confinement, denial of good time credits or opportunities to reduce their sentence, and denial of access to call home or have family visitation. We need to end these punishments. We also need to amend the 13th Amendment and state exclusion clauses that permit forced labor and slavery for people convicted of a crime. But the implementation is important as well, ending punishments that are levied against people for inability or refusal to work, and ensuring that when people are unable to work because of a disability, infirmity, age, will receive permission not to perform the job assigned to them, including people with disabilities. And we need to comply with existing federal disability laws, which most prisons are not doing so with respect to job assignments for people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you.
And I just wanted to add, California is not alone in using incarcerated workers to fight wildfires. It's one of at least 14 states that does so, and not all these programs are fully voluntary, and we have seen serious injuries and deaths result from this work, both for non-incarcerated and incarcerated workers. But when people are desperate to support themselves and need to support themselves while incarcerated and facing legal financial obligations, that $1 an hour, for instance, in California, is a very powerful incentive. And we see some states truly rely on incarcerated workers to perform this work, including, for instance, Georgia. 1/3 of counties rely on incarcerated firefighters to respond to motor vehicle accidents, wildfires, and house fires. And these workers are not paid a cent for their work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, appreciate the accommodation.
Thank you very much. Senator Cotton.
Ms. Turner, in your opening statement, you called the so-called exception clause of the 13th Amendment a gaping loophole. Do you believe that is a loophole?
I do. It is the foundation of prison labor programs today, and it led to the labor programs we have today that we truly have forced labor.
So you think a loophole implies it was unintended or accidental or omission? You think the people who drafted the 13th Amendment and ratified it didn't know what they were doing?
Oh, I think it was absolutely intentional, and it allowed for the use of incarcerated people to replace this free labor force provided by chattel slavery. And we saw it in some states, for instance, in Texas, following the passage of the 13th Amendment. The state of Texas purchased 10 plantations and began running them as prisons, some of which still run today.
So did prisons use labor before the 13th Amendment was passed?
Yes.
So it was just continuing a longstanding practice. It wasn't replacing anything.
It expanded. It expanded. It allowed for the expansion of prison labor programs, and in fact, became so lucrative that it led to passage of laws such as the Black Codes that encouraged the reincarceration of Black men on specialist charges to continue to work in prisons and to provide profit for prisons both in the North and in the South.
And it's your testimony that we need to have a constitutional amendment to repeal that clause.
Yes, there's no place for forced labor in the United States.
Mr. Lehman, as I already mentioned in my opening remarks, in 1930, this committee, quote, unanimously conceded that idleness in prison breeds disorder and that prison jobs help maintain orders in prison by reducing idle time. Does modern day research back up that assertion from almost 100 years ago?
In general, yes, although I think it's an underevaluated question. The Minnesota study I cited earlier finds that there's a strong association between the fraction of time spent working and the level of misconduct declining. That study cites prior research, including, I believe, a study of the federal prison employment system, then called Unicor, which finds that compared to matched controls, people who work are less likely to engage in misconduct in prisons. And the causal story is pretty straightforward. If you're working, it's hard to engage in misconduct.
Okay. And the committee back then also found that prison jobs help inmates acquire, quote, the habits of industry. Is that still the case today?
Yes, and I think the strongest finding in the evidence is that prison labor, even unskilled prison labor, and this goes back to the study of Italian workers, even unskilled prison labor increases labor force involvement, increases wages, increases earnings following incarceration. That, to me, says if it does nothing else, prison labor is a way to improve people's labor market outcomes after they leave prison.
Okay. Senator Booker has a bill that would require prisons to pay inmates the same federal minimum wage that law-abiding American workers outside prison are entitled to receive. I want to explore the financial pressures that Americans face today thanks to Joe Biden's inflationary economy. Do prison inmates have to pay for rent or mortgage?
Not to the best of my knowledge, Senator.
Pay for grocery bills?
I don't believe so, Senator.
Car payments?
No, sir.
Insurance payments?
No, sir.
Gas to drive to work?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Any other daily expenses that most law-abiding American citizens have to worry about?
With certain conspicuous exemptions in some states, in general, no, prisoners are not responsible for those.
If prisons were forced to pay inmates those higher wages, probably a lot higher than what the current minimum wage is, given other Democratic proposals, who is ultimately going to be paying for those higher wages?
In contexts where they're employed by the state or other public entities, the taxpayer ultimately funds those public entities. If they're employed indirectly by private employers, then the people who are paying for those private employers, but that makes their labor much less competitive in that context.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Turner, I want to be sure I understand your testimony. You think prison labor should be voluntary? Is that the ACLU position? Yes. Okay. And do you think,
I'm sorry, my microphone was off, if I may answer on my own.
Yes, ma'am. Did you answer yes?
My answer is that the majority of incarcerated workers wish to work, but it is vital that that work be truly voluntary and that there is no place for forced labor in the United States. Yes.
Okay. And you think that prisoners who do work are underpaid? Is that the ACLU position?
They are underpaid or unpaid. In your state, many of those workers are unpaid.
Okay. Let's take a maintenance worker, which I assume includes people working in the kitchen. What do you think the starting pay ought to be in my state for a prisoner?
Workers should be paid the minimum wage of the state where they live. And there are true fiscal arguments in favor
minimum wage? Is that
minimum wage, yes.
Do you think prisoners should have a 401k?
I think that, my opinion is not what we're asking about. I'm here to provide information and context for the committee.
Do you think prisoners should be provided with a 401k?
If I may answer, The reality is that if we paid incarcerated workers a minimum wage, it would have net fiscal benefits for
Yes,
the
ma'am.
United
I'm
States.
trying to ask you
Workers would be able to pay.
about benefits.
Yes.
Do you think they should be provided with a 401k?
Workers should be eligible to earn into the social safety net. If they're paid minimum wage, workers will be able to earn into
that a
Social
yes
Security
or-
benefits
is that
to
a
support
yes or a
themselves.
no?
That does not include a 401k, but I'm talking about basic social
Do you
safety
think
net.
prisoners should be entitled to paid vacation?
Workers should be entitled to workers' compensation when they're injured or maimed on the job, which happens all too often.
So they should be covered under our workers' comp law?
Yes, absolutely. Workers are working in dangerous
Should prisoners be allowed to
conditions.
unionize?
Yes.
You believe that too? Okay.
It's vital that workers
Should
be able-
prisoners be provided with health insurance, matched by their employer?
Workers should be covered by workplace health and safety guarantees.
Yes,
Incarcerated
ma'am, but
people.
what about health insurance?
Incarcerated people are already guaranteed a basic standard of health
So they
care.
don't
That
need-
is already guaranteed
They
by
don't
U.S.
need
law.
health insurance.
They're already guaranteed that, even though the medical care they receive is usually substandard, and when they're injured on the job, often receive substandard care. They are already guaranteed by law basic health care protections while incarcerated.
Mr. Win, what crime did you commit?
Second-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder.
Okay. Who did you murder?
Jeffrey Owens.
Jeffrey Owen?
Yes, sir.
Why did you murder him?
I was a 16-year-old kid. Jeffrey, me and DeWan had a confrontation, and Jeffrey was an innocent bystander.
Okay. So you shot Jeffrey by accident.
Yes, sir.
You intended to murder somebody else.
I was defending myself against DeWan Lewis.
Okay. Mr. Lewis, you shot at Mr. Lewis
Yes.
and you missed,
Yes, sir.
and you hit Mr. What was his name?
Mr. Jeffrey Owens.
Mr. Owens.
Yes, sir.
Did Mr. Owens have a mother?
I think everybody born in the world has a mother.
Yeah. But was his mother alive when
Yes.
you killed him?
She's still alive.
Okay. Did Mr. Owens have a father
Yes,
who was
sir.
alive when you killed him?
I don't know about his father's.
You never checked?
I mean, as a prisoner in Louisiana, you cannot check on those
Did
type of
Mr.
things.
Owens have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, he did.
Okay. How many?
I don't know.
Okay. You mentioned that your mother cried when you were sent to Angola. Do you know how Mr. Owens' mother felt? Have you ever reached out to them?
May I ask you a question, Senator?
Well, answer mine first.
I would answer yours.
Okay.
And you asking me questions that an incarcerated person cannot answer. I don't know what Jeffrey Owens' mother did, but human anatomy tells me that, yes, his mother had to cry because she lost a son that she brought into the world. Okay. Yes, his father, if he was living, he should have cried. His brother cried.
Did you ever reach out to Mr. Owens' family?
Sir, you're a senator from Louisiana. If a person like me that was incarcerated reach out to any person that's a victim, that's a sentence. You go to prison for that. And I was already in prison, so that's a different sentence.
So you couldn't
No,
write?
by law, you cannot reach out to the victim or the victim's family.
Well, I will tell you, I came today because I thought we were going to have and I hope we were going to have a rational discussion based on empirical evidence on a very complex, nuanced subject. Frankly, I'm disappointed. You know, Ms. Turner, Professor, I just don't think these emotional arguments are at all productive in us trying to solve a problem. People are in prison for a reason. I believe in free will. I get the impression that the ACLU position and the professor's position, I don't know about Mr. Win's position, is that you feel sorry for these folks who are in prison. I wish they weren't there too, but they're there for a reason that really hurt somebody. In Mr. Win's case, he murdered somebody. He actually killed somebody by accident. He meant to kill this person and he shot this other person. He could have killed two. And I'm kind of disappointed. And I just don't think we're going to solve this problem with emotional arguments from people who don't believe in free will and responsibility. That's just my point of view. But I thank you all for being here. And I'll say this, Professor, I was struck, Professor Armstrong, you keep talking about coercive context, that the prisoners are working in a coercive context. It's prison. Prison is a coercive context. And people are there for a reason. And I think you're in la-la land if you don't recognize that. Sure, you can respond.
Thank you so much. So I think the point is, in fact, that it is prison, but it is when prison is combined with being forced to work in certain environments that it can lead to dangerous conditions. And so I think about...
You have no empirical evidence of that.
Actually, I think that I do.
mean,
so another life of mine is...
We can all cherry pick. I mean, people who work get hurt sometimes,
Yes.
whether you're in prison or you're out.
Yeah.
Okay?
So I agree. What I'm talking about, and I think is really important to remember, is that our incredible system of justice will sentence somebody to a certain number of years. But what they're not sentenced to is to lose a limb or to lose a finger, because they're working on defective equipment that isn't subject to the same rules, simply the location of a printing press, whether it's behind the wall or something that is out in the free world. Its location should not determine to what extent it is a
Professor,
regulated
I understand
piece
your
of
point,
equipment.
And you make a valid point, but I've read some of your writings and some of your work, and I just get the impression that you almost think we shouldn't have prisons. That people, there is no free will. That people don't choose to commit crimes, and then if they do, they shouldn't be held responsible for them. And I just don't think you're entitled to that opinion. It's America.
I don't think I've written that anywhere.
To teach your kids that, but I just don't think I don't think most fair-minded Americans agree with you. And that's just my opinion. I'm happy to have this discussion. I thank my friend Senator Booker for calling it. But you all seem to forget the fact that we're talking about prison, folks. And people are in prison for a reason. And they're there. No, ma'am, Ms. Turner, I'm going to have my say. I understand the ACLU position. I'm glad you're not in charge, because we'd have a lot more people hurt in this country.
I'd love to continue the conversation with you, Senator Kennedy.
You can continue the conversation with me. I'm grateful for my friend and his sincere questioning. I want to just jump right in on some of the things that he brought up. And let's just talk about the worker safety rules that we've done for Americans. It's called OSHA. And there are certain things we've done that we think it's horrific if we don't do them, to protect people from everything from the off-gassing of chemicals to, as you said, a printing press that might have unsafe features. When you go into prison, those basic worker standards that protect people from all kind of injury, do they apply in prison? Professor Armstrong.
So the general rule is we don't expect them to apply, especially for things that are happening behind the wire. Now, there are limited circumstances where a state, which has adopted its own OSHA Act, can in fact choose to cover. But even then, we see, according to research by the National Employment Labor Project, that those states have also made a choice not to cover incarcerated workplaces. And so it really does lead to this anomaly where the same activity, the same equipment is regulated when it's outside but not inside.
So what statutory protections in general are there for people that are behind bars when they're working?
Well, I don't think that we have a specific statutory protection, federal or state, for people who are working behind bars.
And so, again, I agree with some of the general statements of my colleagues that if you have done a crime, there should be a related punishment. But work in some environments, like Mr. Win was describing, where there's no regulation of heat, for heat exhaustion, for access to water or access to facilities, things that we would consider putting workers out in those conditions almost torturous to just a human being. That's why the advocacy that we're hearing is that there should be some kind of protections against that kind of extreme punishment. Is that right?
That's correct, and I would just mention two additional things. One is thinking about the provision of safety gear, right? And so, for example, there are cases where people have fallen off of roofs because they didn't have safety belts or toe holds or knee pads. And so thinking about not just what rules govern the equipment, but also are they being provided with safety glasses and safety gear? I think the other part of it is really thinking about the ways in which what we sentence people to. We sentence them to years, not particular injuries, and certainly not to amputations.
Okay, and Ms. Turner, I just want to say that you tried to say a few things. I just want to give you an opportunity to more fully respond, just for the record.
Oh, thank you.
To some of those issues. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Senator Kennedy raised the issue of wages. He also raised the issue of victims of crime. And their economic analysis by Edgeworth Economics and Worth Rises shows there's a true fiscal argument for paying incarcerated workers minimum wage. To pay them a fair wage would actually generate revenue over the long term. And it would benefit victims of crime who would be paid victim restitution. Currently, incarcerated people are saddled with debts for victim restitution they're unable to pay back. When they're released from prison, maintain those debts and struggle to pay them back. If incarcerated workers are paid a minimum wage, they'll be able to pay restitution that will put money in the hands of victims of crime. It will also allow them to pay child support and support their families who are currently going into debt to support their loved one while they're incarcerated. It will allow incarcerated people to become self-sufficient and to have some savings to set them up for success upon release. Studies do show that some savings upon release sets people up for reduced success and reduces recidivism, allows them to gain stable housing, stable employment. That there, in addition, generates tax revenue when this income is taxed.
And Senator Cotton came off very common sense. Well, we make a minimum wage for law-abiding citizens, and they have to pay rent, they have to pay this. How do you respond to that, really what sounded very logical?
The reality is incarcerated workers are currently paid pennies per hour, and they don't even see that much. As much as 80% are deducted. And in the majority of states, room and board is one of those deductions. In the federal PICP program, in which incarcerated workers are employed directly by private corporations are paid a prevailing wage by law, it's a very small number of workers, but over 2/3 of their wages are deducted for room and board. The reality, too, is that incarcerated people are forced to pay incredibly extortionate sums to stay in contact with loved ones, to buy warm clothing, medication, medical co-pays, and these fees build up, and their family members who are already impoverished, who are struggling from the loss of the income from their loved one who's incarcerated, have to step into the breach, and more than half of them go into debt to support their loved ones.
Right, and that's what I wanted to clarify. I want to shift to Senator Durbin in a second, but that incarcerated people actually are charged for rent.
Absolutely.
They actually are charged for numerous things on top of that, and should they be making a minimum wage, those charges now seem much more rational, yet at the same time, from sanitary napkins to telephone calls, I've been stunned on my visits to prisons how much it costs to buy a tampon in prison, a bar of soap, or to call a child. It's, as you said, usury rates. And so this idea that paying minimum wage would be in some way giving them lavish resources is just not true. In addition to the fact that you are citing the evidence that from victim restitution, child support payments, and more, how many times, and I know this, where a man goes to prison and has children from a divorced or separated mother who has no help whatsoever and raises that child in poverty. I'm very grateful that I'm going to go back to, I will resume because I really, Mr. Win, I thank you for enduring that. I want to give you some more chance to talk, but I do want to take a break for the chairman of the entire Judiciary Committee, and I'm grateful that he's here, and I want to let him have his questioning.
Thanks, Senator Booker, for this hearing, and thank all of you for attending. I apologize, I was down one floor with the Secretary of State, Blinken, talking about the situation in our foreign policy, and these conflicts are maddening because I wanted to be here too, and it's a difficult challenge. I've tried in my time on the Judiciary Committee and the few years that I've been chairman to have a focus on incarceration. Much of it stems from an article which I read many years ago by a man named Atul Gawande, a medical doctor who now is working in the administration, who wrote about the impact of incarceration and particularly solitary confinement on prisoners, what impact it has on them as human beings who have on many people. And I've kind of taken up that cause with some success, limited success. I wish there would have been more. But Mr. Win, as I read your life story and what you've been through, 30 years of incarceration, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Starting at the age of 16?
Yes, sir.
And now how long have you been out of jail?
July the 1st will be 4 years.
4?
Yes, sir.
And I see that you're actively involved in a project to try to help others that face that challenge.
Yes, sir.
Tell me about that.
Oh, I have an organization called PIPES, which stands for Priorities, Intentions, and Practical Exchanges. And we do wraparound services for guys that's incarcerated coming home. We also speak on parole board hearings. We assist in filing writs for guys. And we do letter writing campaigns. We do prayer vigils. We also mentor kids that's facing incarceration or are on a trajectory of going to prison. And we try to recorrect the way that they're thinking so that they don't make the bad decisions that we made to go to prison. So we just offer them programming so that they could be better human beings and more productive human beings.
What is the highest priority for the ex-offender? What are they looking for when they're finally released?
Mostly a job. Nothing else really matters because you're playing catch up. So the average person, no, everybody that's coming home, they're trying to take care of themselves. They come home, a lot of them come home. If you're coming home on parole, you're coming home with a debt that never stopped. So you got to pay parole fees. So you need employment to pay those fees so that you don't go back to jail. So then you need transportation. You need a phone for communication to see that whether or not you have a job. And it's hard, especially where I'm from in Shreveport, where second chances are really not fitted for you. It's like if you got that ex-offender on your back, you don't really get a job. So a lot of times we have to make our own jobs.
Ex-offenders in Chicago have some helping hands. We have a Congressman, Danny Davis, who's one of the best in terms of finding ways to give incarcerated people a second chance. Many of them flock to the neighborhoods around where he lives. Many of the churches there are dedicated to it, organizations as well. Some of these people basically need identification cards so they can prove who they are because they've been gone for so long, they don't have a driver's license. They don't have anything to turn to in that regard. And I think we ought to go out of our way, if they want it, to give high praise to those employers who employ the ex-offenders. I've got some friends of mine who are real estate developers in Chicago who look like high rollers who could care less about the little guy. And they're the first to offer jobs for these people. And I think they deserve recognition. Many of them probably don't want to advertise it. They just want to do it. And that's the most important part. Have you seen that kind of cooperation from businesses?
Yes, it's certain businesses that does the same thing. But, you really have to just put them a part of your network so that they could give them. But a lot of times, the job industry, I can speak specifically for Shreveport because New Orleans is much better in New Orleans because New Orleans is more of a city of a second chance. But in Shreveport, it's just becoming a part of understanding the needs of guys that's coming home. So most people will get a yard, mowing yards, or a lawn service job. It's easy for you to get. Or the trucking industry opens its arms to people. So guys will go try to get their CDLs if they can pass that test, because that test in Louisiana is kind of hard. But guys will go out their way to try to get a trucking job.
Let me just say, my time's finished here, and I want to wrap up. I've kind of had this position for many years, and I state it every chance I get. I believe that every member of Congress every 2 years should do two things: visit a foreign country, because I don't believe you come to appreciate your home until you leave it. And secondly, visit a prison. Visit a prison. We make so many decisions, particularly in the Judiciary Committee, about crime and enforcement of crime, enforcement of the law, and that sort of thing, and how we're going to teach somebody a lesson or make our country more safer. And we're doing it based on an image we saw in a movie somewhere, instead of actually visiting a prison and sitting down and talking to the women and men who are there. It'll change your attitude instantly. I'm glad I had a chance to have a conversation with you today. Thanks, Mr. Win. Thanks, Mr. Win.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before you leave, I just want to share something for the record, and I just give you so much credit for it. I came here a decade ago, and the chairman generously put me under his arm and let me work with him on criminal justice issues.
That's a lot to put under your arm.
Yeah, it's a lot. Brought me to the White House in the first weeks I was here to sit around a table with then President Obama. So from its peak, just over a decade ago, when I walked to the Senate, over the last 10 years, the prison population is now down in America 20%, representing 40 million fewer people who've experienced prisons or jails annually. The black incarceration rate has been halved in those 10 years. And black men now are more likely to graduate college than to go to prison, which is a reversal from a decade ago. And this, which again, I want to say for my Republican colleagues who often, correlation, causation, who knows, but during that same time, crime rates fell farther in the states that experienced the deepest declines in incarceration. Your leadership has been extraordinary on that. The fact that amidst a busy day with a lot of significant meetings going on, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I want to jump back in, Mr. Win, with you because I just didn't feel that your voice was coming through in the previous questioning about your experiences, and I appreciate that you sort of enduring that questioning and with good nature. You clearly know that you committed an awful violent crime. At 16 years old, you were not tried as a 16-year-old, you were tried as an adult. And you got sentenced not for 30 years, you got sentenced to life until a Supreme Court, advocated by Republicans and Democrats, changed this idea that children should not have a lifetime imprisonment. And so you walked out after spending, coming in at 16 and then spending almost twice that time of your life in and behind bars. And you've dedicated your life, as many people I know in Newark and he knows in Chicago, some of my most effective people in helping to lower recidivism rates are people who are like you, who come back with a determination to serve. The lessons you learn, the struggles, the pain, the hardship, the shame that you went through, you are doing everything you can through your organization to try to make sure that others don't walk the same path as you. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, there's one thing that's very clear to me, and I'm going to ask my colleagues about this as well, is that we, unlike prisons that we imagine in countries that we demonize sometimes, we don't believe in torturing prisoners. Is that correct, Mr. Win? I said believe, not in actuality. We can discuss this in a second.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
That's true.
No, because I know that a lot of our peer nations call solitary confinement for juveniles torture, because it is proven to have very negative effects on brain development. The majority of children, like you were when you entered, who commit suicide in prison are those who have been served time in solitary confinement. Our own psychological associations call it torture. And so for you to spend this time that you were iterated to me in the hole, as you called it, that I imagine, as you said, hearing those screams and the challenges, I imagine that was, to you, a very unbearable existence.
Yes, sir. Oh, it was very unbearable. It makes you question yourself, because the first time I was in the hole, which was for a work-related offense, and I was thinking, man, how am I gonna survive this? Because it was real dangerous at that time, but just those cells, and people don't realize that being in solitary confinement, your mind tends to eat off itself because there's nothing to do. There's no one with you. You're by yourself. And so as a 17-year-old kid, you got to understand how to live with yourself because you really don't know yourself at 17. So you're looking at walls, and these walls starting to close in, but you know these walls aren't closing in, but they are closing in on you. And you're losing your breath, and you have to call for help. And when security comes, it's like, what's wrong? You like, man, these walls closing in. He's like, man, you losing your mind. And you know that you don't think you're losing your mind, but in actuality, you are losing your mind because those walls aren't closing in, but they are closing in.
Mr. Win, so this is a hearing on work. And I guess the reason why I'm asking you that is because this idea of the line between work, building skills, creating soft skills and habits, all of the things I often know working with young people, that if they don't develop the grit, the determination, wake up at a certain hour, go to work, those are very valuable skills. I think the other three folks have said that, and it prepares you for life. I guess I brought up the issue of solitary confinement because it seems like you're making a choice between two tortures. Is standing out in the heat without the proper rest or the proper hydration, did you see visibly people pass out? Was it on a regular basis or every so often?
Oh, this was like daily. The heat and the exhaustion, it's gonna do something.
So you witnessed people regularly through the heat and the exhaustion passing out. They wouldn't stop the line. They would keep working. Only when a horse would pass out would they think they realized at that point when that beast did that this was a time to stop.
Yes.
And so in your calculation, because you went into solitary confinement because you refused to pick cotton in those conditions, am I right that you felt like this was inhumane treatment and you were trying to decide what is worse, the hole or those work conditions?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So I will say, Mr. Lehman, again, your testimony, I was like cheering parts of it because I think you and I would agree. And again, you work for an organization that I have a lot of agreement with at times. And your data is unassailable that in the sense that, and I love that you pulled in Italy and I think it was Norway. The Avira Institute takes groups over to visit some of these prisons to look at why they might have better recidivism rates than us and why they might have better. You weren't affirming here on the record that kind of work versus, as I visit prisons, again, my faith is a foundation of who I am. So I think of the prodigal son. I think of in Matthew 25. I visit prisons all the time, and I see oversubscribed people trying to get into some of these work programs that really are connected to it. I interview prisoners. What do you think about these works? And but there must be for you a line between what's constructive and what's dehumanizing, degrading, and potentially dangerous to your health.
I mean, almost certainly, I would be sort of hard pressed to draw your bright line, Senator, but that seems reasonable.
Yes. And so I would imagine if I put you in charge, and God, you're thinking to myself, thank God you're not the President of the United States and didn't call me up to do this job. But if I put you in charge of the Bureau of Prisons, I imagine from the research that you've done, you would try to design programs like we did in a bipartisan way in the First Step Act that really are connected to the best evidence of what lowers recidivism rates.
Yes, and I'd underscore the First Step Act, when it was passed, there was a review of the literature commissioned by the criminologist James Byrd that I cite in here to figure out which federal prison rehabilitation programs are evidence-based. And his answer was essentially none of them.
Right.
I agree. You want to pick, and I'm potentially more sympathetic than other people on the panel to the idea that menial labor, that helping to keep the prison clean has a rehabilitative function. I'm less persuaded by the importance of high wages. That said, yes, you want to order prison labor towards those benefits. There's a lot that we don't know, and I think there's a lot of space for bipartisan collaboration on the question of what can we know Because in principle, Senator, left and right should be able to agree that work is a thing that makes people better if it's good work.
Right. And I wonder, Professor Armstrong, do you sort of agree with what Mr. Lehman's saying? Where would you draw the lines? He doesn't want to draw any bright lines, but I imagine you would.
I think there's a lot of scenarios in which work can actually be something that is valuable and also can help create order and security within a facility. I think what's really interesting is in my audits and visits behind the wire, people actually do not want to sit in their cell for 23 hours a day by themselves. That is not what they want to do. Instead, the program that is the most oversubscribed at Angola is the one where they are training dogs to be helping dogs to assist folks with disabilities who might need additional work and assistance. So I think when we think about labor behind bars, one line that I would draw is there the possibility of that person being able to apply for a job, to be able to have some agency or choice in which job they are training for or learning, and then thinking about the connections between that and the market outside, as Mr. Lehman talked about.
And Ms. Turner, I just want to get to this issue of recidivism, which you've studied, and want to give you an opportunity from your data, when you look at educational and training programs, that they're one way to set people up for success. But I don't think we're considering how earning a wage and saving money while incarcerated is also a part of that in lowering recidivism rates. Can you talk about that combination between constructive work and actually making some of a wage as well?
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to say that the studies on recidivism largely focus on the very narrow category of workers, people employed in prison industries jobs, who account for only 6.5% of incarcerated workers nationwide. There really aren't studies showing reduced recidivism rates for the types of maintenance work, janitorial work, kitchen work, laundry work, that the great majority, more than 80% of incarcerated workers are engaged in. Many workers are tasked with tasks like digging ditches and cutting grass, and that's not necessarily going to help them get employment after they're released from prison. And so it's important to distinguish the data here. And in fact, when we talk about forced prison labor, the great majority of this is not helping people. And people are earning very little money, pennies per hour, in 7 states, no money at all. But studies do show that gate money or some savings when people are released from prison will improve outcomes for people. If people are paid minimum wage, not only are they able to support their families and be self-sufficient while incarcerated, and their families won't be resulting in going into debt, as more than half of families with a loved one do, but instead will have some savings to pay first and last month's rent and have stable housing, be able to potentially start a business, support themselves while they seek out employment, and higher paid jobs that provide meaningful skills, vocational training, will lead to better employment. This is a reality. This is what the studies show. This is at least what we know so far. But both are vitally important. As it is now, workers not only cannot support themselves while they're incarcerated, but they leave prison saddled with debts that attach to their criminal conviction, legal financial obligations that they can't pay while they're incarcerated, and struggle to obtain employment after their release. I also want to mention, we talked about licensing restrictions that bar people from employment, and California is one example where people battling wildfires were initially barred because of their criminal conviction from working as firefighters. But the reality is that state licensing restrictions bar many formerly incarcerated people from engaging in work directly related to the work that they learned and took on while incarcerated. And these state licensing restrictions often aren't related to their crime of conviction. It's one thing to say you can't be involved as an accountant if you have a white-collar embezzling conviction, for instance. But someone who's worked as a hospice aide in prison, who's worked for years tending to dying and sick incarcerated people, may be barred in many states from obtaining work as home health care aides or hospice nurses. And that's a problem as well. And while we look to the solutions that ensure people can succeed when they reintegrate into their families and their communities, we also have to consider ending these barriers to employment for people after they're released.
That's excellent. And Mr. Win, you can give firsthand insights of the distinguishing between work. You had said, I think very compellingly in your testimony, that your experience you had working your fears, but you worked other jobs, including a tire walker, a culinary school, and a nurse's aide. And you said something really profound in your testimony, that the nurse's aide position, you said, I think you used the word, had a transformative impact on your life. Can you explain that differentiation and the value of working jobs that have an impact on people after prison?
When you're working in the field, you don't feel like that has any value. You don't feel like you're going to get out. You know that you don't want to get out and do that anymore. When you're working in culinary, now you know that you're setting yourself up to get a good job after incarceration. When you get a nurse's aide, you would like for that, if you have a compassion for it, you would like for that to open up the doors. But like Ms. Turner said, in Louisiana, being an ex-offender, you really can't get a job in that field, even though you have the skills to do it. That door isn't open for you. But people in prison work, they try to get the skills that'll get them a good job when they come back into society.
And what do you say to Senator Cotton, who said that cleaning toilets and mopping floors, it seemed like he was trying to indicate that there's some kind of dignity in that, or it's important to do, and maybe we as Americans have no problem with thinking people who've committed heinous crimes would have to do that stuff. How do you speak to that?
It's kind of hard to speak to it because he has a fixed mindset. But anybody that's open-minded know that that's kind of like a degrading job, but it's a job that people need. And so, when you go in a hotel, you want to walk into a clean hotel room. So we know that someone that cleans toilets, cleans rooms, that's a job for them. But when you're coming from incarceration for committing a crime,
right,
that's not a job that you have aspirations to come home and do. You want to do something more worthwhile.
And I imagine this sense of, I am paying my victim compensation. I am paying for my children's well-being.
Yes.
So if those were attached to a salary that was more commensurate with the work, I would imagine people would want to find that pathway to redemption through that work. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, because the average person that's working in Angola, that I can speak specifically about because I did 30 years of my life there, when a guy moves from making 2 cents an hour to making, let's say, 16 cents an hour, a lot of those guys be saying, man, I'm finna save this little money to send my daughter something. I'm finna save this to buy my kids some tennis. Man, so don't ask me to buy you nothing from canteen because I'm not buying you anything. I want to send my mama something. So they'll save. It might take them a month to buy whatever it is, 2 months, 3 months to do it, but they feel a sense of being a man because now I can provide something to my kid or I can provide something to my mother. And that's big for a person in prison.
Thank you. Professor Armstrong, as we get ready to close, I just want to ask, is there some points that you came here to make that you weren't able to make yet?
Thank you for that opportunity. So I think one thing that's really important is to understand the ways in which we kind of harm our own goals and our own intentions, right? So if the idea is that a person by the end of their sentence has paid their debt, because that is what they are sentenced to, then when they leave the prison, they should be able to earn a living and return as someone's neighbor. So there was a reference, I believe, to programs in Norway. And what I think is remarkable about those programs is that they are really looking at who comes back to us as a neighbor, right? And so we can have debates about, what an appropriate sentence is, but in no democratic and transparent society do we sentence people to a term of years and then say, yes, but it's okay to kill them or to injure them or for them to have amputated limbs, right? That can't be a part of our judicial sentence. And any sentence that would include that, we would say is barbaric. And so it's worth thinking about the ways in which we can make incarcerated labor look as close as possible to free labor, and that will serve all of the goals and purposes that have been mentioned today. Thank you.
Mr. Lehman, I'm grateful for you taking time. I know this is not easy to come here, but do you have any final words to say? You should turn on your microphone.
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the opportunity. I think that the reality that we have to deal with is that it is easy to wish that people can reintegrate into society. It is much harder to accomplish that. I talked about in my testimony briefly ban the box laws or clean slate laws and the surprising non-effect on employment following release. And a straightforward explanation for that is that it is not necessarily the criminal record alone that makes it harder for people to get jobs afterwards, that employers are seeing something different in ex-offenders. Similarly, it's great when vocational ed works. On average, vocational ed doesn't work. It is very hard to get vocational ed right in an incarcerated context. That doesn't mean that there aren't strategies. One strategy, if I have 20 seconds for your attention, Senator, the thing I would recommend you think about is employment insurance for ex-offenders, which in surveys increase willingness to hire them by 25%, and I think is a totally underexplored policy idea. There are options on the table. They all start with admitting that the problem is a lot harder than removing impediments. It's about taking people who are often profoundly dysfunctional and trying to get them into a position where they are less dysfunctional. That's an extremely challenging problem. If we're honest about that, there's really no room for success.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. Ms. Turner.
Thank you. I just want to underscore that prison labor is a unique arrangement. The employer is the jailer. The employer has complete control over incarcerated workers, and incarcerated workers are a uniquely vulnerable workforce. They've been stripped of basic workplace protections. They have no say in the work assigned to them, and there's no oversight or regulation over workplace conditions. And this leads to predictably awful outcomes, including permanent disability and deaths. And we also have a tremendous lack of information and data. I spent years researching this, and we filed Freedom of Information Act requests with every state Department of Corrections and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and only about half of the states responded. The Federal Bureau of Prisons could not even refuse to tell us the number of incarcerated workers in federal prisons who are working maintenance jobs. We know a lot about prison industries programs, which, as I've mentioned before, is about 6.5% of incarcerated workers' job assignments. We know very little about how many people are working. We are extrapolating from surveys conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but there's really a need for more information about injuries workers sustain. For instance, AP filed FOIA requests for California Prison Industry Authority. We know that 600 injuries were reported over a 4-year period, but most of those records are redacted. We know a fair amount. We know a lot of people were injured, suffered eye injuries because they weren't provided safety goggles, but we don't really know about everything that's happening in prison. We need both legal protections, standard workplace protections, wage and hour protections, the right to unionize, and the end of forced labor. We need to end forced labor. And we need to protect these workers, because what is happening today is for many workers, is purely exploitative and violates our human rights commitments.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Win, this is how we're going to do this. You're going to say your final words. I'm going to say my final words. And then I'm going to submit for the record, unless there's an objection, and I don't see any of my colleagues objecting, a section of a documentary that I think will give more color to your words, frankly. And then I'm going to gavel out. Does that sound good, Mr. Win? You, me, video, we're done. Go ahead, Mr. Win.
Okay. We need to separate punishment from exploitation, because to sentence a person to life, that's punishment. You exploit a person by sending them in the fields for no money, because there are people behind those walls that are mothers and fathers. We understand that victims have been left, but those people behind those walls could work, pay the victims. That's paying the debt to society, because we never factor that in. It's all about punishing. And it's all about let's let these big businesses get free labor from these guys in prison. But that's exploitation. But just look at it from a different angle. Let the guys and the women in prison let them work. And they can pay the victims back so they pay their debt, and they can take care of their families. We need to understand that those are humans. But a lot of people don't look at it as those guys and women being humans. They're prisoners. So we dehumanize them in ways by just saying prisoner instead of saying Senator Cory Booker is now incarcerated. No. 413, whatever his number is, that's who it is. So now I don't have any emotional attachments to him. He's no longer a part of the human race. But we'll put a dog behind a cage. If we leave a dog in our car and go in the grocery store and come back with the windows up, we're going to incarcerate the person that left that dog. So we give more care and concern about that dog than we do with that human being that's trapped inside of a cell when the temperatures are 110 degrees and that tear doesn't get any ventilation and he's falling out or he dies behind those bars because he committed a crime. So the crime takes more precedence over the human. So there's no more human decency when you become a convicted felon. So we need to just start separating that punishment and that exploitation. And we need to start understanding and realizing and not forgetting the fact that those are human beings. Like Senator Kennedy was asking me about, do I think about the mother of the victim? Of course. So that's a punishment that I live with every day of my life that he would never understand. Because when you commit a crime and you really change and you're really remorseful for it, that's a punishment that you would never, ever overcome. So I live with a daily punishment that no one can see, that no one can understand but a person that did it. So should I be punished for the rest of my life by society also? Thank you.
You know, Mr. Win, I felt uncomfortable when he was questioning you. And I think it's because exactly what you're saying. I've watched so many young men, young black men, at these terribly young ages get engaged in a world that just has them end up dead or has them end up in prison. And we deny them, as you said, it almost sounds like a Les Mis, just their number. We deny them their humanity. And we reduce them to the lowest, worst day of their lives. That's their entire definition. That one moment that he replayed with you, that becomes the totality of their being. And we don't see the full human being. There's not a person in this vaunted Senate chamber right now who hasn't desperately needed grace in their lives. And grace, by its very definition, is unmerited love and kindness. You didn't deserve this. And the quality of our grace in this country worries me sometimes because we don't extend it to even an individual like you who spent decade after decade after decade in prison for a heinous act you did when you were 16. You are not, the sum total of who you are is not that crime. You are every day working to define the totality of who you are. And these ideals of redemption, these ideals of grace and rehabilitation, and ultimately, the quality that we manifest in our society is as much of a reflection of the people who are incarcerated as those who are doing the incarcerating us. What story are we telling about ourselves? And so I just want to say in particular to you today, your voice here mattered. Your voice added a lot of clarity. You are a firsthand person to experience this at a time, as my colleague said, where most Americans do not go into prisons to see what's really going on. Don't sit down to listen to people we incarcerate. Well, I don't believe there are any throwaway people. So I'm grateful for your presence here, as I am for all three of all four of the witnesses. It is a very important conversation, and evidence suggests we could do a lot better towards empowering people to to return home and not recidivate, and that we can have a prison system that does not torture people, harm people, injure people, make them more likely to be sexually assaulted or discriminated against. That's what we're striving for. And anyone who looks at American prisons and jails today and says this reflects the best of who we are and doesn't need any improvement is just wrong, deeply wrong, and is implicated, in my opinion, as a barrier to trying to create more substantive evidence-based reforms. I want to play the video, please.
I feel like I had became a slave, a product of the convict system, because everything that I was doing was profiting the prison.
How much do you get paid to come out here?
2 cents an hour. At one time, we made 4 cents an hour, and for some reason or another, the budget got cut. It's injustice.
Many were making pennies an hour. Some were getting nothing at all. Others were being contracted out to private companies or taking part in work release programs. Prisoners can sometimes be punished for refusing to work, even thrown into solitary confinement. And if they are hurt on the job, they often have little recourse.
They aren't eligible for workman's compensation, nor are they protected by other worker safety laws because they're not considered quote-unquote employees.
Well, when I first went there, I was signed to the field.
Working in the fields, my first job, that's everybody's first job.
Oh, I worked in the field for 25 years.
I was working in the fields.
Pulling up cotton stalks in the field, in the mud, my hand was bleeding, and I realized that I was the machine.
There's no capital asset or value that is necessarily protected. Because the idea is that if a person dies while laboring or in their care, but incarcerated, that the state will simply fill that bed through its criminal legal system.
I want to thank the ranking member, Senator Cotton. I want to thank each of our subcommittee members who came today. I want to thank our subcommittee members that may be submitting questions for the record. I want to thank the witnesses for testifying today. I want to remind members of the subcommittee that questions for the record are due a week from today, Tuesday, May 28th at 5 p.m. And I ask the witnesses, I know this is a burden with all that you all do, but I ask the witnesses to respond to those questions, not just in a timely manner, what it says here, but as thorough as possible. All of you are extraordinary in your capacity to illuminate this situation. I ask you to do that. I want to, again, thank you for this hearing. I thought the conversation was constructive and meaningful. With that, I gavel out. This meeting's adjourned.